Hi. I was not ready for that. We were having a conversation. But I did talk to, we were talking about things going on in the world right now, which is very appropriate. Um, but the process and the cost, um, because the organization actually owns the property. And so you have to be able to set up an organization as a basically reassociate the church as a private entity or like its own standalone, and it's going to be affiliated with a new organization. Yes, and they have to pay. Yeah, how much? That's right. It's a, yep, to take care of the pensions and stuff that's still going on because part of that comes from the local churches. Their regular tithe and offering goes to pay for building maintenance and property taxes. Or they don't pay property taxes, but property upkeep and for retirement funds and stuff. But the struggle is they have to pay that. The people who are disaffiliated have to pay it in a lump sum. It's an upfront cost, and it's like 10. They're paying for the next 10 years. They're basically it's a 10-year buyout practically, and it has to come in a lump sum up front. For yeah, basically. Yeah, for yeah, that's usually what happens. Yeah. Hi, Chelsea.
Hi.
Hey, what's coming up Sunday at 2 o'clock in the morning?
We're going back to standard time. I was
Great
like, how am I
answer.
supposed to say that?
Yeah, we're falling back. We're changing our clocks are going backwards an hour. So all of you people with smart technology won't have
Don't
to
have
do
to
that
worry
on
about
their
it.
own. On your own. But you should be able to come bright-eyed and bushy-tailed Sunday
I
morning.
remember as a kid my mom going through the house.
Like
Like
changing clocks.
Yeah, at like 10 o'clock at night and changing all the clocks. I'm like, why are you doing that? I had no
Yeah.
concept for any of that.
I would have waited until my kids went to bed to do that probably.
So they get the extra
That way
hour.
at least they're in bed instead of like arguing over
It's only 9 o'clock now,
yeah.
Mom.
I still have to change like I'm trying to think of all the clocks in my house that I still have to change.
The microwave and the oven. That's it.
Is that it?
Yeah. The girls have to change their alarm clock, but that's it.
My smartwatch is not very smart most of the time. It'll get unassociated because I don't.
Yeah.
And so like right now it's like 6.5 hours off. I don't know how that works. It's supposed to like keep up with no.
Nope.
I guess I have to sync it to my phone in order to do that. So we have that coming up on Sunday. Another life-changing event happens on Monday. We have a daughter who has a 15th birthday.
Oh, I'm like, I didn't get prepped for that one.
And then
I was there.
And then Tuesday.
I was there.
Tuesday, you should.
I didn't realize it was on Monday. Wow.
It is Monday. Tuesday, the 8th, you should review your polling place.
Correct.
And
yes.
go and vote.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of a big deal.
Very big deal.
I won't tell you who to vote for, but you should vote.
That's right.
That's how I'll do that. Check that box. Speaking of boxes.
Look at your transitions.
Wow. I do have the box this time.
Say what?
This is.
I know, that was really good.
It's a great transition.
Very smooth.
Project Christmas Child. We have 20 boxes that we're going to fill. We're going to fill them on the 13th. I think that's the right date.
I'll be there. I don't know.
Yeah.
What day
Not
of the week?
it's a Sunday.
Oh,
Sunday
okay.
afternoon, evening time.
Yeah,
We'll figure out the
13th would be
exact
a
time.
Sunday.
But we'll gather supplies and we'll fill them together so we'll have them ready to give out. We're going to do 10 6 to 9-year-old boy boxes and 10 6 to 9-year-old girl boxes.
I feel like that's the hardest age to shop for, too.
Why?
I don't know.
So if you want to get something for them, we can get
Hmm.
little dolls, pencils, notebooks, toothbrushes, soap and a rag.
Toothbrushes, soap, and rag is something that they want in everyone, right?
Yeah, it's what we'd like to. We'd like to put multiple toothbrushes in each box. Yeah, they're going to third world countries, to people who don't have really
Gotcha.
anything,
Gotcha.
and so that's what that's going to be. Looking forward to that. If you want to donate, if you want to participate, it takes all of us to make it happen. We're going to work together as a community to fill the boxes together all at the same time. So if we can gather all the supplies, we can make an assembly line, have a good time, have some snacks, have our kids and everybody involved in putting them together and making a difference. That's that. Any other announcements you'd like to make?
Oh, that's good.
It's such a good transition, man. Good job.
Anyway.
So, great job. Great job. All right. So tell me, Chelsea, let's where we're going this week is very important. I mentioned a kind of controversial conversation, or a tough conversation, and I want to have that. But before I have that, what I'd like to do is use my handy dandy pop quiz partner over here, and let's have some understanding of where we've been and why this is important. Where do we start? What does every good story starts?
In the beginning.
At the beginning. And my story starts at the very beginning. Before a story, you get the what?
Huh?
Preface.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And in the preface of the story of the Bible, where is it? What do we consider the preface?
The first 5 books? I don't know. Oh, shoot. The Genesis.
Genesis.
He said before.
I said before. Hey,
I have an outline for you since we didn't go
to help
over
you.
much of it. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
I didn't look at it.
So the preface is Genesis chapter 1 through 11.
Genesis. There you go. Yeah.
In these first 11 chapters, what do we get?
The creation story.
We get a lot of creation stories.
Of them, yeah.
Like 3 of them.
Oh, well, okay. It
Right?
feels like a lot more than that, but yeah.
Well, at least 3 of them, because we get
The
Genesis
actual creation
1,
story.
and then we get the fall of man in Genesis 2 and 3. Genesis 2. And then we get the Noah story, which is another creation story. All in the preface. And what is that? Why is that preface so important? What is it telling us? What is going on in this time frame? In every ancient civilization, there is what?
Is it on the board?
No, it's not.
Bummer. I don't know.
There is no society in the world without religion.
Huh.
In the ancient world, there are 0 societies in all of the world associated with no religion. 0 established societies in the world without religion.
Huh.
And so, in this preface that we get, this book is written to Jewish
Eastern people.
Easterners, Jewish people, Hebrews. And the first 11 chapters of the Bible are all these stories about who?
The Creator.
About God.
Mm-hmm.
And why God is what from all those other gods that they've been introduced to. He's different. This is the introduction of God himself and why he's so different. And then while we're watching God be different and the failures of man over and over again, and we think this is not going well, what happens? really the end of chapter 11, beginning of chapter 12. We get introduced to who?
Abraham.
Abraham. So we get this family, the whole rest of the book of Genesis. 38 chapters in Genesis are focused on 4 individuals. Who are they?
Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph.
That's right.
Oh.
Abraham, Isaac, Jacob,
I was trying
and
to
Joseph.
decipher that, but
Man, really good stuff. Really, really good. And
hold on.
yeah, really good. And what do these people do? What do they have in common? Are they perfect?
Oh, no.
What do they have? There's a word. Chutzpah.
Oh, I got
Very
that
good.
one too. Chutzpah, yeah.
And from there, we enter into this narrative. And we talked about this narrative of the Bible and what is going on. We called it a tale of what? A tale of two
cities.
No, that would be a short story, I'm pretty sure. Tale
was the best.
Tale of two, yeah. A tale of two kingdoms. What are the two kingdoms?
Oh, hold on. I do know this.
There's a stick, 2 different kinds of sticks.
It only has one answer up there, Dad.
Yeah. You got to know the other one. Your dad definitely knows this. Empire versus what?
Peace.
She phoned a friend. She got
I
peace.
did.
Shalom. Empire versus shalom, or peace. Empire versus peace. And this is the competition that's going on the whole rest of the time. Because our human nature and where they have found themselves is where?
What?
Where do they finish? Man, Genesis, where do they finish? Where are they geographically?
Egypt.
They're in Egypt.
Oh, I didn't know I thought you meant metaphorically.
No,
I didn't know.
Specifically,
okay.
Geographically, they find themselves in Egypt, the greatest empire at the time.
Right. Yeah.
And it is all centered around the control and power of who?
The Pharaoh.
The Pharaoh and all of their gods. And they were very Western in their way of doing life. They had apartments. They had a standard wage. They were paid for services and duties, and they were employed. Like it was an empire, and they were accumulating extra homes and extra people and building a safety net and a provision unto themselves. But right. God says, hey, walk away from that.
Right.
Isn't that the call of Exodus that we talked about? They were working the Goshen Valley, most fertile land in all the world.
Yeah.
And God says, come out into the desert. And it's like,
are you sure?
Are you sure? And so what happens, we find that narrative in a competition in Exodus. And in Exodus, God rescues them from their abundance. Completely unrelated,
it
unnecessary.
Feels like such an oxymoron.
Yeah, completely unnecessary for today's times, though. Rescued from their abundance, and he calls them out into the desert, and he says, what? He wants them to commit to him in what? What did we call it?
A marriage commitment.
In marriage. He says, come and commit to me in marriage. And you should look back, you should watch, or we could have a conversation later on. The Mount Sinai as a marriage
it's mind-blowing.
Is really, it will change the way that you look at that whole conversation.
Yeah.
And what does God give his people? Like he gets to Mount Sinai and calls them to marriage, and then he says, what is the main focus of all the rest of the book of Exodus?
Getting to know him. What? No, I don't know then. Tabernacle.
The tabernacle, okay. And the construction and the design of the tabernacle. That is the entire rest of the book of Exodus.
I skipped ahead to that one. Sorry.
Yeah. Why is the tabernacle so important?
It's a central piece.
What did God say? It is the central piece. It is the dead center of where they're going to be. And that tabernacle is so important because what does God tell the people? In Exodus 19, I believe, before they get to Sinai, before he leads them through this process of this marriage process at Sinai, he says, if you will accept me, I will make you what? A kingdom.
I was going to say a great nation.
A kingdom of something.
Priests.
Kingdom of priests. Where do priests operate? In the presence of God. So he's got to give them a place where they can interact with his presence. Mm-hmm. And that's the focus of the, hey, I'm willing to commit to you and make you a kingdom of priests. Are you willing to commit to me? And they say yes. And go through this whole marriage ceremony. And he gives them the tabernacle, which is the intimacy space between him and them. Between God and his people. And then he has to do something next that takes us from Exodus into the book of Leviticus. What does he have to teach them? He said, I'm going to make you a kingdom of priests, makes them this place of intimacy. And what does he have to teach them?
Atonement.
He's got to teach them how to be a priest.
Right.
So he says, well, in order to come to me, you've got to be purified. You have to be holy. Right. So he shows them how to find atonement, and he draws them into his presence, and he says, this is how you stay in my presence. And so he's teaching them what it means to be a kingdom of priests. He's teaching them how to live how he desires for them to live so that they can be set apart. And after they learn this, they're spending time. He's teaching them how to go through this in what? What do you do after you get married?
Your honeymoon.
You have a honeymoon. In their culture, how long was the honeymoon?
A whole year.
A whole year. Why?
Because they didn't know each other before.
They didn't know each other before they got married.
At all.
So they got excused from working the fields. They got excused from going to war. They got excused from paying taxes because it was husband and wife getting to know each other. And we're the bride, and God the groom, Jesus the groom. We're paired together, don't know him, don't know his ways. And he says, these are my ways. Let's practice them together. Mm-hmm. And all the time, not going hungry.
Right.
Not going without water. There's great conversation in there about the water. There's crazy. I'm going to continue on. Then you get to the edge of the promised land. He says, I'm taking you to this space. And they get to the edge of this space, and Moses doesn't get to go in. And he knows it by now that he doesn't get to go in.
Back to that conversation about water.
That conversation about water, yeah. Yeah. Bonus points. How many times did the people complain about water? 3 times. We think it's like, oh, they're always complaining. 3 times. 40 years in the desert, they complained about water 3 times.
And then Moses doesn't go in the promised land.
And then Moses doesn't go in the promised land because of the 3rd time. Anyway, so there's so much to that. Can't get into it right now. So before they enter the promised land, Moses has one more opportunity to stop them all and talk to them. And he says what?
Remember.
Don't forget. Remember where you came from, where you were when God found you, and don't forget who?
AOWs.
AOWs. Aliens. Not AOC, AOWs.
Aliens, orphans, and widows.
Aliens, orphans, and widows. Very, 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 very important. And so now that God has spent time with his people and he's taught them what it is to be a priesthood, he says, go and occupy this space. And what do we wrestled with the story of Joshua probably not happening exactly the way that it says that it does.
Right.
But God's trying to teach us a bigger lesson in it, right?
Right.
He wants us to be where he's placed us, to operate as priests, and to make a difference. Like, he wants us to possess the land where he's placed us and to share him with other people and to make a difference.
Right.
So important for us to be planted. And again, that takes us back to that conversation about the tribe of Dan and everything that happened there. But God placed his people at the crossroads of the earth on purpose.
Yep.
Because if you're a kingdom of priests and you have the presence of God and you're going to be a blessing, and because you're blessed by God, you're going to bless all the nations of the world. Probably ought to be where all the nations of the world cross through.
Yeah.
And that's where God puts his people. A highly contested piece of land that only knows war. And then we're in the land, and we get this cycle in the book of Judges. That if you search Google, it is
the sin cycle.
Sin cycle. But we looked at it as what type of cycle?
Redemption.
Because God's grace is abundant, and his forgiveness never ends if we're moving in the direction of him. Yeah?
Right.
And we got this picture that happened pretty much at the same time in the next book, in this love story of the book of Ruth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the power of faithfulness and righteousness. And then we interacted with David and Saul. But if you read the Bible, is there more than one place where you read stories about David and Saul?
Yeah.
And Solomon?
Yeah.
Where are they?
Well, I'm going to guess 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles.
So, why in the world do we read stories, and they're different stories?
Mm-hmm.
The stories about David in the book of Kings are different than the stories about David in the book of Samuel, and those are all different from the stories about David in the book of Chronicles. Kind of weird. Focus on different details. It's crazy. It's really kind of out there. Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever been reading through the Bible and you get to like 1st and 2nd Kings? You're like, okay. And then they start listing off kings and you're like, okay, now where does that one go in? What?
Honestly, I just kind of skip over that part.
This is what a lot of people do. They're like, I don't know.
How is that applicable to me?
What king? Where is he? Who's his dad? How did he become king again?
And why do I care?
Yeah. And then when you get, so you've read through that and you're like, okay, I got it, I think. And then you get to Chronicles, 1st Chronicles, and you're like, how did we get back on Saul again?
Because that's way backwards.
How did we?
Yeah. And
I've never heard this story about David. Like, I've read all the way to this point chronologically. And so what is the end of the Old Testament? Is a great question. What's the end of the Old Testament?
You want the answer that I gave you earlier?
Yeah.
Malachi.
So Malachi is the end of the Old Testament, and it ends with what?
I don't know.
Anybody? Malachi? End of Malachi ends with? Do you want me to read it?
Well, no. I asked if I would need this, and you're like, nope, you don't need it. But I obviously needed it.
What does Malachi end with?
Oh, gosh, it's quick.
I'm not turning to Malachi, but you can. Go ahead.
Oh, okay, fine. One page off. Seriously? Utter destruction.
It ends with talking about tithes.
Well, the great day of the Lord.
And it says what?
About tithes?
Mm-hmm. Bring your whole tithe into the storehouse.
I thought that was in verse 3.
That's Malachi. I think it's Malachi 4.
No.
6.
4 is the great day of the Lord.
2. Might be 2, yeah.
He will turn the hearts of fathers to their children and the hearts of children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction.
What would be a decree of utter destruction? Anybody else have a different word used there? Strike the land with a curse. And this is like the dun dun dun.
And then Jesus.
And you have heard it preached probably.
Never, actually.
A few times.
No.
That the Old Testament ends with a curse. And then there's the silent years. And then Jesus shows up. What if I told you that's not the end chronologically of the Old Testament? Nor is it even close.
But because we're Westerners, we read them in order thinking.
We don't read them in chronological order.
No, we
our
read
Western
them.
Bible,
I'm saying we read them from left to right.
Our Western,
that's gotta be it.
Our Western Bible is not chronologically organized.
No.
In about the 1400s, 1500s, they reorganized the Bible and changed the Jewish Old Testament order. And there's a lot of things that happened, and they'll say there's a lot of conversations. I'm going to oversimplify this, but there's a lot of conversations. There was a lot of anti-Semitism at the time. There were a lot of conversations about how they organized them. They organized them by genre, by Western genre, those type of things. But why would they reorganize it differently?
I don't know.
And maybe that is true. With the Jewish Old Testament, if you have a blue letter Bible or a Jewish Old Testament, it will not be organized the same way. The oldest writing of the Old Testament is Chronicles. We have it in two sections, First and Second Chronicles. There are two sections. Most often in the Jewish Bible, they are one. And so it kind of puts things in a different perspective. The Chronicles ends with a blessing. And so the declaration of a blessing from God before the years of silence, far more consistent with the character of God than a curse followed by a whole bunch of silence. Malachi was actually written about 500 to 600 years before Jesus. Scholars like to argue about everything, especially biblical scholars. If you get consensus on anything with biblical scholarship, you probably have a whole bunch of people paid by the same place, is what you have. So there's all kinds of discussions. The writing of the book of Chronicles, or First and Second Chronicles, was probably somewhere between 450 and 300 BC. The writing of First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, which would actually just be Samuel and Kings. There's not divisions in them in the Jewish letter. Was somewhere between 1100 and 800 BC. So you get what we have as 6 books of the Bible, but 3 divisions of the Jewish text that were written somewhere 500 to 800 years apart. So they probably have some different details and different information and different perspective at the time. Well, I mean, think about if you had newspaper clippings and headlines and stories from World War II. And that's how you read it. Those events were detailed. Are you going to get all the details exactly right from the newspaper clippings that were from the same time? You're going to get certain details that the writer or the person who handed off that writing thought was very, very important and captured the story of what was going on. But if you watch World War II in color documentary, which I do enjoy documentaries, and so I have watched multiple World War II documentaries, you're going to get a lot more specific, detailed information, yes? Mm-hmm. And the hindsight of what was happening from the other side. This is the difference between Samuel and Kings and Chronicles. So I like to consider 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings kind of the headline information of what was going on. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself a little bit. I'm going to go back just a second.
Okay.
And talk about the Tanakh. Do you know what that means?
I have no idea.
Tanakh is the Old Testament, the Jewish Old Testament, Tanakh. And it's actually focused on three things: the capital T, the capital N, and capital K in the word Tanakh. That is the Jewish Old Testament. When Jesus in the New Testament references the law and the prophets, he never mentions all of Tanakh. He is talking about the Torah and the Nevi'im, the law and the prophets.
Which now, he says that.
That's what he says,
yeah.
The law and the prophets. What is the law? Torah, the books of Moses,
yeah.
which actually collected and written down after Samuel and Kings. It was actually transcribed on paper, on scrolls, after. The earliest writings are the prophets.
Wow.
The earliest actual writings are the prophets. All of the history of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all verbal until they started writing it down. And it actually, they accredit all the writings and information from Moses, but we don't actually, there are multiple authors that collected all of the oral traditions. He didn't ever actually write it down. So the actual writings themselves are after the prophets. It will, some of the books that are considered prophets. So when Jesus is talking and he says the law and the prophets, and he talks about Torah and the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim would be the third one, the K, that is the Jewish writings. They were still being canonized at the time that Jesus was alive. They were already written, but they were still being canonized and approved. So they would not have been considered authorities. So let's talk about books that are in the Nevi'im. They are prophetic books. So they are writings and collections of information that are not necessarily exact to the happenings, but they are going to be collected and spoke prophetically because it is the communication of God trying to teach us something.
Mm-hmm.
That's history via Eastern scholarship between the Jewish scholars. Okay? So I know we're going. So the Nevi'im, the prophets, what are some of those books that are in there? The Nevi'im, the prophets, would be Joshua, Judges, the book of Samuel, the book of Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. So when Jesus references the law and the prophets, he's Torah and the Nevi'im. Those are the books he's referencing. Now, do you read the book of Joshua and go, and that's a prophetic book?
No.
But does that not give more understanding to why it's not necessarily a history book? It is God communicating a story to us through history.
That makes sense, yeah.
Through the happenings. But also, the Jewish people would consider Samuel and Kings prophetic books. But Chronicles is not. Also, not in the prophetic books, in the law and the prophets, book of Daniel.
That was the one I was questioning, why it wouldn't be.
Because of its later authorship, it wasn't included. So when Jesus is referencing the law and the prophets, he's referencing this.
He's not even, and people hang so much weight on the book of Daniel.
And here's the thing. There is a reference in the New Testament that includes all of them, that's attributed to Jesus. It's in the book of Luke. But depending on the argument over when the book of John, the Gospel of John was written, the Gospel of Luke, the latest of all the Gospels written. Gospel of Mark, the earliest New Testament writing. Then Matthew, probably Acts comes, or John, some of the writings, Luke, Acts. Anyway, so the Gospel of Mark is the earliest gospel recorded. Anyway, so it's clear as mud.
Yep.
Really good stuff. And so then the Ketuvim is the writings. That's Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Solomon, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, which was actually one story, but we split it in two. And then Chronicles. That is chronologically how they would read it. This is chronologically how they would appear.
Oh, so from Genesis to Chronicles.
From Genesis to Chronicles. And that's where the Jewish Old Testament would end. So when we, in a Western organized Bible, read 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and we read them and we immediately associate them with this is the order that they've always been in. When we look at them chronologically as in the way that the Jewish Old Testament is put together, we go, okay, we're reading these two, and then there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26. 26 books worth of happenings
between these two things.
Between these two things.
Does that make a difference in what this says?
It makes a difference, and we're going to get into it next week more, but it covers all of the same information, and what we're getting is in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, those agenda-driven, those sole, narrow-focused headlines of what's happening, not necessarily all the facts of what's going on. This isn't fact-checking. This is prophetic understanding of what's going on. This, on the backside, is historical writings, really more of a documentary perspective, because they have the perspective of time. And so the easiest way to say this is 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Consider that from the perspective of the northern kingdom of Israel. Not its geographic location, but its time in history. Because it gets carried off and destroyed much earlier than the kingdom of Judah. So these writings are much earlier, and it's about what is happening. And these writings are much later, having the perspective of this is what happened and this is what led to it. So what we see with David and Bathsheba, it's here and here. Well, let me rephrase that. The story of David, Bathsheba, is a huge part of here. It's completely overlooked here. We look at the story of David and Bathsheba and David's happenings in his life in 2nd Samuel, and we're like, that was the tipping point. That's where everything changed. But the book of Chronicles looks back at David's life and goes, yeah, that was a hardship, but he was still this man in his personal life, even in spite of his failure, and completely overlooks it. And it's just because they have the opportunity of looking back at what has happened and all the happenings since and go, yeah, it probably wasn't as big a deal. But in the moment, don't we get caught in this same trap personally? Like in the moment, it's life or death and it's the end. And then with hindsight, we go, it was still a bad decision and I wouldn't make it again, but it didn't change the character of who I am. And so this is the conversation of these things. And so we can have conversations about different stories and different things. Next week, we're going to dive into this a little bit more, but in some specific places in this transition. I'm kind of focused on David and Solomon over the next couple of weeks as we lean into other things, and we're going to find our way into the prophets. So if you have specific stories in these, we can have different conversations about them. This can be something that I do want to have a discussion about it, but I think it can be something that's kind of uncomfortable for us because it's not what we're used to. It's not what we're where we find ourselves, and it kind of we're just trying to build a framework for understanding, so that as we read the scripture we can actually understand the concepts and the consequences of what we're reading and why certain things are there. And so we're trying to build out a framework so that we can help you read the Bible, understand the Bible in your own life, and be able to be comfortable with going, okay, that doesn't sound quite right, let's talk about it, and let's have a conversation of one of the things that we have looked at an Eastern perspective of reading the Bible. It's okay to ask questions and go, where's the problem in this story? And usually that's pointing us to where the point of that story being included in Scripture is. And so, great exercise to be a part of. Want to invite you to join us and participate in Operation Christmas Child. Have a great week.